"You're too old for family photos, Mom." My daughter said it with a smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, while adjusting her dress in the hallway mirror before Thanksgiving dinner. I stood there holding the pumpkin pie I'd spent 3 hours making from scratch, the ceramic dish still warm against my palms, and I felt something inside me crack. Not loudly, just a hairline fracture that would eventually split me open completely. I'm Dorothy Whitmore, 72 years old, and before I tell you what I did next, I need your honest answer. If your own child erased you from their life while you were still breathing, would you have done what I did? Or am I the monster everyone will say I am? Keep that thought, because by the end, I want your verdict. It started small, the way betrayal always does. Little cuts so tiny you convince yourself they're accidents until you're bleeding out and can't remember when it began. My daughter Rebecca, 46 years old, had always been what people called ambitious, the kind of woman who climbed corporate ladders in stilettos and never looked down to see who she stepped on. I was proud of her, truly. The way she built her marketing firm from nothing. The way she married Daniel, a surgeon with kind eyes and steady hands. The way she gave me 2 grandchildren, Ethan and Sophia, who I loved more than my own breath. But somewhere between her corner office and her 5,000 square foot house in the suburbs, Rebecca stopped seeing me as her mother and started seeing me as a problem to be managed, a relic from a simpler time that didn't photograph well against her carefully curated life. The Thanksgiving incident wasn't the first time I'd been excluded, just the first time she said it out loud, the first time the quiet erasure became a spoken truth. 6 months earlier, Ethan had graduated from high school, and Rebecca threw a garden party with white tents and a string quartet. 200 guests in summer pastels drinking champagne on the lawn. I arrived wearing my best dress, the lavender one I'd worn to Rebecca's wedding, and her assistant, a young woman named Chloe with a clipboard and an earpiece, intercepted me at the gate. "Mrs. Whitmore, Rebecca wanted me to let you know the photographer is setting up formal family portraits in about an hour, but she's only doing immediate family this time. You know, keeping it intimate." I smiled, because that's what you do when your heart is being carved out with politeness, and I said, of course I understand. Even though immediate family had always included me until apparently that moment. I spent the party on the edges, watching Rebecca pose with Daniel and the kids, watching her laugh with her in-laws, watching her hug colleagues and friends, and not once did she seek me out. Not once did she introduce me to anyone as her mother. I was a ghost at my grandson's celebration, translucent and irrelevant, taking up space in photographs I wasn't invited into. When I got home that night to my small apartment across town, the one-bedroom place I'd moved into after selling the family house to help Rebecca with her business startup costs, I sat in the dark for 3 hours, still wearing that lavender dress, and I cried the way you cry when you realize you've been slowly disappearing and nobody noticed because nobody was looking. The next morning, Rebecca called while I was making coffee, her voice bright and busy, asking if I'd enjoyed the party, telling me how exhausting it had been, how relieved she was that it went well. And I heard myself say yes. Yes, it was lovely. Congratulations to Ethan. My voice steady, even though my hands were shaking. That was June, and by November, I had become an expert at swallowing my hurt, at pretending not to notice when Rebecca rescheduled our weekly lunches, when she stopped returning my calls for days, when she sent Daniel to pick up the Christmas decorations I'd offered to bring over because she was too busy to see me herself. I told myself she was stressed, that successful people have demanding lives, that I was being needy and old-fashioned, that this was normal for modern families. But somewhere deep in my chest, I knew it wasn't stress or busyness. It was something else, something colder, a decision she'd made about my value, about whether I fit into the life she was building, and I had failed some invisible test I didn't know I was taking. Thanksgiving morning, I woke at 5, the way I always had, and I started cooking my mother's recipes that Rebecca grew up with: the pumpkin pie with real cream, the sweet potato casserole with the pecan topping, the green bean almondine she used to beg for as a child. I packed everything carefully in my old station wagon, the one I'd been driving for 15 years because it still ran fine, and I saw no reason to replace it. And I drove the 40 minutes to her house, arriving exactly when she'd told me to come. 2 o'clock, not too early, not during the morning chaos. The house was already full when I arrived: Daniel's parents and siblings, Rebecca's business partner and her family, neighbors I didn't recognize, children running through rooms that smelled like expensive candles and roasted turkey. Rebecca met me at the door wearing a cream cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and she kissed my cheek the way you kiss distant relatives you're obligated to acknowledge, quick and dry and finished before it started. "Mom, you didn't have to bring anything. The caterers handled everything," she said, taking my pie with the tips of her fingers like it might contaminate her. I followed her to the kitchen, where a team of professionals in black aprons moved around a marble island the size of my living room, and Rebecca set my dishes on a counter near the back door, away from the artfully arranged charcuterie boards and the tower of profiteroles. And I understood without her saying it that my food wouldn't make it to the table, that it was already waste, that my 3 hours of labor at 5 in the morning meant nothing because it wasn't catered, wasn't Instagram-worthy, wasn't part of her vision. I stood in that gleaming kitchen with its subway tiles and its pot filler faucet and its wine fridge, and I smiled and said how lovely everything looked, how wonderful she'd done, and Rebecca smiled back with that same empty expression and said, "Thanks, Mom. Why don't you go find a seat in the living room? We'll eat soon." So I did. I went to the living room where Daniel's family had claimed the best sofas, where Rebecca's business partner held court near the fireplace, where children played with expensive toys on thick rugs, and I sat in a chair near the window, the kind of chair that faces away from the room, decorative but useless for actual conversation, and I watched the afternoon light fade while conversations happened around me. Through me, without me. Dinner was called at 4, and we moved to the dining room where Rebecca had set a table that belonged in a magazine. Gold-rimmed china and crystal goblets and a centerpiece of white roses that probably cost more than I spend on groceries in a month. Place cards and calligraphy directing everyone to their assigned seats. And mine was at the far end, past Daniel's teenage nephew and the business partner's husband, tucked into the corner, where I could barely see Rebecca at the head of the table, where I was close enough to be counted as present, but far enough to be forgotten. After dinner, while the caterers cleared plates and brought out dessert, Rebecca stood and announced that a photographer was here to take family portraits before everyone left. And people started migrating toward the living room, touching up makeup, straightening ties, gathering children. I stood too, smoothing my dress, checking my reflection in the hallway mirror. And that's when Rebecca appeared beside me, her hand light on my arm, her voice gentle in that terrible way that means the knife is coming. "Mom, actually, we're just doing immediate family for the portraits this year, keeping it simple, just the 6 of us." I looked at her, at my daughter, at the child I'd raised alone after her father died when she was 9, at the girl I'd worked 3 jobs to put through college, at the woman I'd given everything to, and I said, "I don't understand." Rebecca sighed, patient and irritated at once, the way you sigh at someone who's being deliberately difficult. "Mom, you're being too sensitive. It's not personal. We're just doing nuclear family this year. Me and Daniel and the kids. Daniel's parents already understand. It's just simpler for the Christmas cards. You know how it is." I wanted to say I didn't know how it is. I wanted to ask when I stopped being family, when immediate stopped including the woman who gave her life. But instead, I heard myself say, "Okay, of course, I understand." And I watched her walk away. Watched her gather Daniel and Ethan and Sophia and Daniel's parents. Wait, Daniel's parents were immediate family, but I wasn't. And they all posed in front of the fireplace while the photographer adjusted lights, and I stood in the hallway holding my purse. My coat already on, because I understood what was happening. I understood I was being told to leave without being told to leave. And nobody came after me when I walked out the front door into the November cold. I drove home in the dark, my hands tight on the wheel. My vision blurred not from tears, but from something worse, from clarity, from finally seeing what I'd been refusing to see for months, that Rebecca was erasing me deliberately, systematically, removing me from her narrative one photograph at a time, and I couldn't understand why, couldn't figure out what I'd done to deserve this careful cruelty, this polite elimination. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my small bedroom staring at the ceiling, at the water stain I kept meaning to have fixed, and I thought about all the ways I'd made myself smaller over the years to accommodate Rebecca's growth. How I'd sold the house without complaint, how I'd accepted the reduced visits, how I'd never questioned why she needed space, how I'd swallowed every hurt and called it love. And I wondered if love was supposed to taste this bitter, this much like disappearing. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I called my lawyer, the same man who'd handled my husband's estate 25 years ago. Ronald Chen, now in his 70s, still practicing, because he said retirement was for people who didn't love their work. "Dorothy, good to hear from you. It's been years. What can I do for you?" His voice was warm, familiar, the sound of someone who remembered when my life was different. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, and I said, "Ronald, I need to update my will." There was a pause, professional and weighted, and he said, "Of course. Come by the office. We'll set everything in order. Are you all right? Is something wrong?" I wasn't all right. Everything was wrong. But I said, "I'm fine. I just need to make some changes." And we scheduled an appointment for the following week. That week, I went through my apartment systematically, going through papers and files and boxes I hadn't opened in years, and I found things I'd forgotten I had. Things that mattered, documents and letters and proof of things Rebecca had conveniently forgotten or never knew. I'd always been good with records, a habit from my years working as a bookkeeper before I married, before I became a mother, before I built my life around my daughter's needs instead of my own, and now those records told a story of sacrifice and giving and love that had been taken for granted, that had been packaged and sold to fund someone else's dreams and then discarded when it was no longer useful. The numbers were startling when I laid them out. $50,000 for Rebecca's college tuition, another $30,000 for her graduate school, the $120,000 loan I'd given her to start her business that she'd paid back in full with interest because she was responsible about money. I'd give her that. But there were other numbers too. The inheritance from my mother that I'd split with Rebecca when she bought her first condo, another $70,000. The babysitting I'd done for free every week for 5 years while she built her client base, hours I never charged for. Labor that would have cost her $40,000 if she'd hired someone. And the house, the family house I'd sold for $300,000 and lived off the proceeds, thinking I was being practical, downsizing, making things easier. But now I saw it differently, saw how I'd dismantled my own foundation to give Rebecca everything she needed to build her empire. And somewhere in that exchange, I'd become invisible, become unnecessary, become the embarrassing reminder of her humble origins. Ronald's office hadn't changed. Same wood paneling, same leather chairs, same view of the harbor where seagulls circled ferry boats, and he greeted me with a firm handshake and concern in his eyes that told me I looked different, looked older, looked like someone who'd been hurt in ways that leave marks. "Tell me what you need, Dorothy," he said. And I told him. I told him everything, not emotionally, not crying, just facts. just the steady recitation of what my daughter had become and what I needed to do about it, and he listened without interrupting, taking notes in his careful handwriting, nodding occasionally, his face betraying nothing until I finished, and the silence settled heavy between us. "You're sure about this?" he said finally. Not a question, a confirmation. And I said yes. Yes, I was sure. Surer than I'd been about anything in years. We worked for 3 hours, drafting new documents, establishing new parameters, creating a plan that was legal and airtight and exactly what I wanted. And when we were finished, Ronald walked me to the door and said, "Dorothy, I hope you know what you're doing. These are significant changes, permanent changes. And I worry about you." I appreciated his concern truly, but I said, "Ronald, I've spent the last 25 years hoping someone would see me, value me, include me, and all it got me was erased from family photographs. I'm done hoping. I'm done waiting to matter." And he squeezed my hand and said, "Call me if you need anything, anything at all." And I promised I would, even though we both knew I wouldn't, because I was done needing things from people who didn't think I deserved them. December was quiet. I didn't hear from Rebecca except for a text 2 weeks before Christmas asking what I wanted, as if my existence could be summarized by a gift request, and I replied that I didn't need anything. Truly, I was fine. And she sent back a thumbs-up emoji, the universal symbol for you. Acknowledge your message, but don't care enough to respond with words. Christmas morning, I woke up alone, made myself eggs and toast, watched the snow fall outside my window, and waited for a call that didn't come, a visit that didn't happen, an invitation I knew wouldn't arrive, because Rebecca was doing Christmas at Daniel's parents' house this year, keeping it intimate, keeping it small, keeping it free of me. New Year's came and went, and in January I received a card from Rebecca with a family photo enclosed, the same photo from Thanksgiving, the one I hadn't been invited into, all 6 of them smiling in front of the fireplace, immediate family, and on the back Rebecca had written in her perfect handwriting, "Wishing you a wonderful New Year, love, Rebecca, Daniel, Ethan, and Sophia." And I put it on my refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a pineapple. Not because I wanted to look at it, but because I needed to remember what I was dealing with, needed to keep the anger fresh instead of letting it soften into sadness. February brought my 73rd birthday, a Tuesday, unremarkable, except that it was the first birthday in 46 years that Rebecca didn't call, didn't send a card, didn't acknowledge at all, and I sat in my apartment eating leftover Chinese food and watching game shows. And I thought about how easy it is to stop existing when people stop remembering you exist. How death doesn't always require your body to stop working. Sometimes it just requires people to stop seeing you, and I was dying in the most silent way possible. Through neglect, through erasure, through the careful removal of my presence from the narrative of my own family. That night, I pulled out the documents Ronald had prepared, read them again carefully, checking every word, every clause, making sure this was what I wanted, making sure my anger hadn't clouded my judgment, and I decided yes. Yes, this was right. This was necessary. This was the only power I had left. The power to control what happened after I was gone. The power to speak when I could no longer speak. The power to be heard when I was finally, permanently, undeniably absent. March came with rain that turned the city gray and soft, and I started feeling tired in ways I hadn't felt before. A heaviness in my chest that made stairs difficult, made grocery shopping exhausting, made simple tasks feel like climbing mountains, and I ignored it the way you ignore warnings you don't want to hear, the way you pretend your body isn't trying to tell you something important, because acknowledging it means acknowledging your own mortality, and I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. Wasn't ready to give Rebecca the satisfaction of needing her, of being weak, of being the burden I suspected she already thought I was. But the tiredness got worse, and by April, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Couldn't pretend that waking up exhausted after sleeping 10 hours was normal, that the shortness of breath was just age, that the occasional chest pain was indigestion. And I made an appointment with Dr. Morrison, my physician for 20 years, a practical woman who didn't sugarcoat things, who believed patients deserved the truth even when the truth was hard. The tests came back on a Thursday, and Dr. Morrison called me into her office, not the exam room, her actual office with the desk and the family photos and the diplomas on the wall, and I knew before she spoke that this was serious, that you don't get called into the office for good news, that the comfortable chair and the box of tissues on the desk meant preparation for tears, for shock, for the moment when your life divides into before and after. Dorothy, I'm not going to dance around this. You have congestive heart failure, significant damage, likely from years of high blood pressure we didn't catch early enough, and the prognosis isn't good. We're talking months, maybe a year with treatment, maybe less. I sat there looking at her, at this woman who'd seen me through menopause and arthritis and the normal decay of aging, and I felt strangely calm, felt like I was watching this happen to someone else, someone in a movie, someone whose story I already knew the ending to. And I said, "How long exactly?" She shifted papers, showed me charts I didn't understand, said, "If we start aggressive treatment, medication, possible procedures, you might have 12 to 18 months. If we go palliative, focus on comfort and quality of life, maybe 6 to 9 months. It's hard to say with certainty. Every patient is different." 6 to 9 months, I had 6 to 9 months to continue being invisible, to continue calling a daughter who didn't call back, to continue existing on the edges of a family that had already moved on without me. And something in me rebelled against that idea, against dying the same way I'd been living, quietly, politely, without making waves, without demanding to be seen. "I want to think about my options," I told Dr. Morrison, and she nodded, said, "Of course, take your time. We don't have to decide today. But Dorothy, I need you to tell your family. They need to know. They need to prepare. This isn't something you can carry alone." I promised I would tell them, promised I would make the calls, have the conversations. But when I left her office and got into my car, I sat in the parking lot for an hour, my hands on the wheel, the engine off, and I thought about what it would mean to tell Rebecca I was dying. Thought about whether she would care, whether she would suddenly remember I was her mother, whether guilt would bring her back, or if she would just see it as an inconvenience, another thing to manage, another obligation to fulfill with minimal effort. And I realized I didn't want to know the answer. Didn't want to give her the chance to prove she was as cold as I feared. That night, I called Ronald, my voice steady. No tears, just business. And I said, "Ronald, I need to finalize everything. I need to make sure all the documents are in order. I need to know that when I'm gone, what I wanted will actually happen." And he was quiet for a long moment before he said, "Dorothy, why now? What's happened?" I told him about the diagnosis, about the timeline, about the choices I had to make, and he listened, and when I finished, he said, "I'll have everything ready within the week. Triple-checked, notarized, ironclad, you have my word. And Dorothy, I'm so sorry. I wish things were different." "So do I wanted to say. I wish my daughter loved me. I wish I hadn't given everything only to be given nothing back. I wish I mattered enough to be included in a photograph. But instead, I said, "Thank you, Ronald. I appreciate everything you've done." And we hung up, and I sat in the dark of my apartment, in the space I'd made small to accommodate someone else's big life, and I felt something settle in me, a kind of peace. The peace of knowing exactly what I was going to do and why I was going to do it. The next few months were strange, surreal, like living in a dream where everything looks normal but feels wrong, where you're going through motions that no longer have meaning, and I didn't tell Rebecca. Didn't tell anyone except Dr. Morrison and Ronald. And I started taking the medication, started going to the appointments. Not because I wanted to live longer, but because I wanted to live long enough to finish what I'd started, to see my plan through to its end, to make sure my voice would be heard even after I could no longer speak. I saw Rebecca once during that time, ran into her accidentally at the grocery store in late May, and she looked surprised to see me, looked like she'd forgotten I existed in physical space, like I was a ghost who'd suddenly materialized in the produce section, and she hugged me quickly, air kiss on the cheek, asked how I was doing in that bright, empty voice people use when they don't actually want an answer. And I said, fine, everything's fine. How are the kids? And she said, great. Ethan got into Cornell. Sophia made varsity tennis. We're so proud. And I congratulated her, said how wonderful. And we stood there in the fluorescent light between the lettuce and the tomatoes. Two strangers who used to be everything to each other. And then her phone rang and she apologized. Said she had to take this. Work call, you know how it is? And she walked away, talking into her phone, and didn't look back. And I finished my shopping and drove home, and added that moment to the list of reasons why what I was doing was right, was necessary, was the only honest thing left. By July, I was weaker, the medication wasn't working as well, and Dr. Morrison gently suggested we talk about hospice, about making arrangements, about quality of life versus quantity of time. And I agreed to hospice, agreed to letting nurses come to my apartment, agreed to the morphine for pain. But I asked for one more month, just one more month at a functional level, because there were things I needed to do, a letter I needed to write, preparations I needed to make. And she gave me drugs that would keep me alert, that would steal time from the end to give me clarity now. And I took them gratefully, knowing I was borrowing from a bankrupt account, but needing the loan anyway. The letter took me 3 days to write, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I needed to say it perfectly, needed every word to land exactly as intended, needed my absence to speak louder than my presence ever had. And I wrote draft after draft, crossing out lines, rewriting paragraphs, until finally I had something that felt true, felt complete, felt like the last thing I needed to say to a daughter who'd stopped listening years ago. Dear Rebecca, it began, and I could already feel her reading it, could imagine her sitting in her beautiful house with her beautiful life, my words disrupting her carefully maintained peace, and I continued. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and I'm sorry that the only way I could make you see me was by becoming permanently invisible. But here we are, and there are things you need to know. Things I never said while I was alive, because saying them would have required you to listen. And you stopped listening the moment you decided I was an embarrassment instead of your mother. I wrote about the numbers, the money I'd given her, the sacrifices I'd made, not to make her feel guilty, though guilt was certainly deserved, but to make her understand that everything she'd built, everything she was proud of, everything she'd accomplished, had been built on my foundation, on my work, on my erasure. And she'd never once acknowledged it, never once said thank you, never once included me in the success story that only existed because I made myself small enough to fit underneath her dreams. I wrote about the photographs, about Thanksgiving and Ethan's graduation, and every other moment I'd been carefully excluded from, and I said, you told me I was too old for family photos, but what you meant was I was too ordinary, too unglamorous, too reminder of where you came from. And you couldn't have that in your narrative, couldn't have the bookkeeper's widow in the frame with the successful businesswoman and the surgeon husband, and the Ivy League children. So you erased me, and I let you. And that's on me. I let you treat me like I didn't matter, because I was afraid that fighting back would mean losing you completely. But here's the truth, Rebecca. I lost you anyway. I lost you the moment you decided your image was more important than your mother. I wrote about love, about what it means to love someone, to give them everything and ask for nothing back except to be seen, to be valued, to be included, and how she'd failed that most basic requirement of family, how she'd turned motherhood into a transaction where I was only worth what I could provide, and when I couldn't provide anymore, when I'd given everything and had nothing left to give, I became disposable, became the past tense of her story, became someone who existed only in old photographs she kept in boxes instead of on walls. And then I wrote about the will, about what I'd done with the money I had left, the life insurance policy I'd kept for years, the investments I'd made, the small but significant estate I'd built through decades of careful living and smart choices. And I wrote, "You thought I was poor? Thought I was living hand to mouth in that small apartment? Thought I'd given you everything and had nothing left. But I had plenty, Rebecca. I had enough to live comfortably, enough to leave you something substantial when I died, enough to prove that I'd always been thinking about you, always wanting to help you, even after you stopped wanting me. But here's the thing. I changed my mind. I changed everything. And when you read the will, when you see what I decided to do with the estate you thought was yours, I want you to understand that this isn't revenge. It's consequence. It's the natural result of treating your mother like she doesn't exist. And maybe now, finally, you'll see me. You'll think about me. You'll remember I was more than a shadow you stepped over on your way to somewhere better." I sealed the letter in a heavy cream envelope, the expensive kind, the kind that feels important in your hands, and I wrote Rebecca's name on the front in my careful script, and I gave it to Ronald with explicit instructions that it was to be opened at the reading of the will, that Rebecca had to read it in front of witnesses, that she couldn't take it home and throw it away unread, that she had to sit there and absorb every word while people watched her face, watched her realize what she'd lost, what she'd thrown away, what her cruelty had cost her. The will itself was elegant in its simplicity. I left Rebecca nothing, not a dollar, not a photograph, not a piece of jewelry, nothing. And instead, I divided my estate among charities that mattered, organizations that helped women like I'd been, single mothers working multiple jobs, widows trying to survive on nothing, older, women made invisible by a society that only values youth and beauty, and I set up a scholarship fund in my late husband's name for students who came from working-class families, who needed help, who reminded me of who Rebecca used to be before she decided she was too good for her origins. The total amount was $375,000. The life insurance, the investments, the money I'd saved by living small, by driving the same car for 15 years, by eating simple meals and never taking vacations, by making myself as inexpensive as possible because I'd internalized the message that I wasn't worth spending on. And I could have left it all to Rebecca, could have added to the wealth she already had. But instead, I gave it to people who would actually need it, who would actually appreciate it, who would say thank you and mean it. I knew what people would say, knew they'd call me bitter, call me cruel, call me a vindictive old woman who punished her daughter for the sin of being busy, but I didn't care about other people's judgments anymore, didn't care about being seen as difficult or unreasonable. I only cared about the truth, about making sure that my death, my absence, my permanent silence would finally say what my living voice could never make her hear. In August, I got worse. The hospice nurse came every day, a kind woman named Patricia, who didn't ask questions about why I never had visitors, who just held my hand and managed my pain and made sure I was comfortable. And she became the closest thing I had to family in those final weeks, This stranger who cared for me because it was her job, but who did it with such genuine compassion that I cried sometimes when she left. Cried for the daughter who should have been here, who should have been holding my hand, who should have been saying goodbye, but who didn't even know I was dying because I never told her, never gave her the chance to perform grief, never let her turn my death into another opportunity to prove she was a good daughter when we both knew she wasn't. On a Tuesday in late August, I woke up and knew it was close, knew from the way my body felt distant and light, knew from the way sounds seemed muffled and far away, knew from the way Patricia looked at me with those gentle, sad eyes that said she'd seen this before, this threshold moment, this crossing, and I asked her to call Ronald, to tell him it was time, that he needed to arrange everything now, that the plan needed to happen while I could still confirm it was what I wanted, and she made the call, held the phone to my ear, and Ronald's voice came through, steady and professional, even though I could hear the grief underneath, and he said, "Dorothy, it's all set, exactly as you wanted. I'll make sure everything happens exactly as you specified. You have my word." I thanked him, thanked Patricia, thanked the universe for giving me enough time to finish what I'd started, and then I closed my eyes and let the morphine carry me away from the pain, away from the disappointment, away from the life where I'd loved someone who couldn't love me back, and I thought about Rebecca one last time, thought about the baby I'd held, the toddler who'd called me mama, the child who'd needed me absolutely, and I wondered when exactly she stopped needing me, when need turned into obligation, obligation into resentment, resentment into erasure, and I couldn't pinpoint the moment, couldn't find the split where everything changed, so I stopped trying and just let go. I died on Wednesday morning, August 23rd, with Patricia holding my hand and classical music playing softly from the radio, Chopin, something gentle and sad. And the last thing I thought about wasn't Rebecca, wasn't the hurt, wasn't the anger. It was my husband, Albert, and how much I hoped he was waiting, how much I needed to see him again, to fall into arms that had actually wanted to hold me, to be seen by eyes that had actually looked, and then everything went quiet and soft, and finally, peaceful. The funeral was small. Ronald arranged it, a graveside service on a Friday afternoon in September. Just Ronald and Patricia, and a few people from the church I used to attend, the ones who remembered me before I became invisible. And they stood around my casket in the September sun and said kind things, generic things, the things you say when someone dies quietly and without much notice. And Rebecca came. She came with Daniel and the kids, and she wore black and she cried. And I wondered if the tears were real, or if they were the performance tears, the I'm a good daughter tears, the look how sad I am tears. But it didn't matter, because I wasn't there to see them, wasn't there to judge them. I was underground in a box next to Albert, finally home, finally where I belonged. After the service, Ronald stood at the front of the small chapel the funeral home provided and cleared his throat, and he said, "Before everyone leaves, there's the matter of the will. Dorothy requested that it be read today, immediately following the service, and that certain people be present." And he looked directly at Rebecca when he said certain people, and I could feel her confusion even from wherever I was, could feel her wondering why a will reading had to happen now, today, immediately. But she stayed. She and Daniel and the kids sat in the front row, and Ronald opened his briefcase and took out the documents, the ones we'd prepared so carefully, and he began to read. The first part was standard. The legal language about being of sound mind, about revoking all previous wills, about my wishes being clearly stated and legally binding, and Rebecca shifted in her seat, probably bored, probably thinking about the meeting she'd missed to be here. probably calculating how much she'd inherit and what she'd do with it. And then Ronald got to the part we'd written together. The part that would change everything, and he read in his clear, professional voice. To my daughter Rebecca, I leave nothing, no money, no possessions, no photographs, no jewelry, no furniture, nothing. I leave her the same absence she gave me, the same invisibility, the same erasure, so she can understand what it feels like to be nothing to someone who should have loved her. The chapel went silent, the kind of silence that's loud in its emptiness, and I could feel Rebecca's shock, even though I couldn't see her face. Could feel the moment when the words hit her, when she understood what was happening, when she realized I hadn't just died, I'd struck back. I'd used the only power I had left, the power of what I left behind, and I'd left her nothing deliberately, purposefully, as a message she couldn't ignore, couldn't dismiss, couldn't pretend she didn't receive. Ronald continued, My entire estate, consisting of $375,000, is to be divided as follows. And he listed the charities, the scholarship fund, the organizations that would actually appreciate what I was giving them. And with each name, Rebecca's face must have gone whiter, must have shown the progression from shock to disbelief to rage. And I wished I could see it, wished I could watch the moment when she finally understood that actions have consequences, that you can't erase someone for years and expect them to gift you anything but their absence. But the letter was the real moment, the real strike, and Ronald pulled it from the envelope, the heavy cream one with her name in my handwriting, and he said, Dorothy also left a letter to be read aloud at this reading, and Rebecca tried to interrupt, tried to say no. This is private, you can't read it here. But Ronald looked at her with the authority of a man who'd been practicing law for 50 years and said, Actually, Dorothy specifically requested that this be read in front of witnesses. It's a legally binding part of her will, so I'm going to read it now, and everyone here is going to hear it. He read the whole thing, every word I'd written, every accusation, every hurt, every moment she'd erased me, and the chapel was silent except for his voice and the occasional sound of Rebecca's breathing, sharp and fast, like she was drowning, like she couldn't get enough air. And when he got to the part about the photographs, about being too old for family pictures, I heard someone gasp. Might have been Patricia, might have been one of the church ladies, someone who understood the cruelty of that moment, the precise cut of those words. And Ronald kept reading, kept delivering my testimony from beyond the grave, kept making Rebecca sit there and listen to everything she'd done, everything she'd been, everything she'd destroyed. When he finished, when the last word had been spoken and the letter was folded back into its envelope, Rebecca stood up, her legs unsteady, her face red and wet with tears that might have been shame, might have been rage, might have been grief. Hard to tell, hard to care. And she said, This is cruel. This is vindictive. She was my mother. How could she do this? And Ronald, bless him, said in that same calm, professional voice, She was your mother, yes, and you treated her like she was nothing, so she left you nothing. Seems fair to me. Daniel tried to comfort Rebecca, put his arm around her, but she shook him off, and she turned to the small crowd of witnesses and she said, You all heard this. You all heard what she did. You'll tell people. You'll tell everyone how cruel she was. And Patricia, sweet Patricia, who'd held my hand while I died, stood up and said quietly, We'll tell people you didn't visit your mother while she was dying, that you didn't call, that you didn't know she was sick because you'd already decided she didn't matter. We'll tell people that. Rebecca left the chapel, nearly running, and Daniel followed with the kids, Ethan and Sophia looking confused and scared. And I felt bad for them. Genuinely bad, because they were innocent in this. They loved their grandmother even if their mother had tried to erase her, and they didn't deserve to be caught in the explosion of their mother's choices. But some lessons require collateral damage. Some truths can't be spoken softly, and I hoped that someday they'd understand. That someday they'd read my letter and know I did this not to hurt them, but to teach their mother what she needed to learn. That people aren't disposable, that love isn't optional, that being included in a photograph shouldn't require begging. I know what you're thinking right now. Some of you are nodding, others are judging me hard. Drop a comment with your honest reaction, Team Dorothy or Team Rebecca. I genuinely need to know if I was justified, because even now, even from wherever I am, I wonder if I went too far, if there was another way, if I should have just let it go, let her inherit everything, let her win. But then I remember Thanksgiving, remember that lavender dress at Ethan's graduation, remember every phone call she didn't return, every lunch she canceled, every moment she chose her image over her mother. And I think, no, I did the right thing. I spoke the only way she would finally hear me. The fallout was immediate and spectacular, Ronald told me later, after, in whatever way we communicate now. He told me Rebecca tried to contest the will, hired lawyers, claimed I wasn't of sound mind, claimed I'd been manipulated, but Dr. Morrison's records were clear. My mental capacity was never in question. I was sharp until the end, and every single document was notarized, witnessed, legally airtight, so the judge threw out the contest in less than an hour, and Rebecca had to pay her lawyers out of pocket, another few $1,000s gone to try and prove her mother was crazy, instead of just finally, righteously angry. Daniel left her 6 months later, filed for divorce in February, and I heard through Ronald, who heard through courthouse gossip that he cited emotional cruelty as one of the reasons, that watching how Rebecca treated me, how she reacted to the will, how she tried to make herself the victim, had opened his eyes to who she really was underneath the polished exterior. And he decided he didn't want to be married to someone capable of that level of coldness, didn't want his children learning those values. So he took primary custody, and Rebecca got weekends, and I felt a complicated mix of satisfaction and sadness about that. Satisfaction that consequences were piling up. Sadness that my grandchildren were suffering for their mother's sins. Rebecca's business suffered too. Word got around about the will, about the letter, small town, big gossip, and clients started looking at her differently, started wondering what kind of person gets publicly disowned by their dying mother, started questioning whether they wanted to work with someone capable of such spectacular failure in the most basic human relationship. And her business partner quietly bought her out, and Rebecca took the money and moved to a smaller house in a different town. And I heard she works from home now, freelance, no staff, no fancy office, no corner suite, just her and her laptop and the ghost of what she used to be. Ethan came to visit my grave on his first break from Cornell, brought flowers, purple irises, my favorite, and he sat on the grass next to my headstone and he talked to me, told me about his classes, about his roommate, about how much he missed me, about how sorry he was that he didn't know I was sick, didn't get to say goodbye. And he cried, really cried, and he said, "Grandma, I read your letter. Mom showed it to me, and I understand why you did it. I understand. And I'm not mad. I'm just sad. Sad that it had to come to this. Sad that you felt invisible. Sad that I didn't see it happening. And I wanted to reach down from wherever I am and hug him. Tell him it wasn't his fault. That children can't fix their parents' failures. But I couldn't. So I just hoped he felt something, some warmth, some presence, some sign that I heard him, that I forgave him, that he was always, always one of the lights in my life, even when everything else was dark. Sophia came too, a year later, after she graduated high school, and she brought a photo album. Our photo album. The one with pictures of us baking cookies, going to the park, reading stories, all the grandmother-granddaughter moments Rebecca tried to erase but couldn't, because Sophia had kept them, had hidden them in her room, had refused to let her mother delete me from family history. And she showed me each page, narrating the memories, crying and laughing at the same time. And she said, "Grandma, Mom never talks about you anymore, pretends you never existed, but I won't let her do that. I won't forget you. I tell people about you all the time, about how strong you were, about how you taught me that loving yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. And I'm going to make you proud. I promise." Rebecca never came to the grave. Not once in the 5 years since I died. Not on my birthday. Not on the anniversary of my death. Not on Mother's Day. Never. And I think that tells you everything you need to know about her. Tells you that even after everything, even after the will and the letter and the consequences that destroyed her life, she still can't admit she was wrong, still can't face what she did, still can't say I'm sorry to a headstone, and that's sad, sadder than anything I did to her, because it means she learned nothing, changed nothing, is still the same person who told her mother she was too old for family photographs, and that's a life sentence worse than anything I could have inflicted. The scholarship fund I set up has helped 43 students so far, first-generation college kids from working-class families, kids who remind me of Rebecca before she forgot where she came from. And every year, Ronald sends me a report, wherever I am, somehow I get it. And I read about these kids, about their dreams, about how they're studying engineering and nursing and education, about how they write thank you letters saying this scholarship changed their life. And I feel something like peace, something like redemption, knowing that my money, my sacrifice, my careful savings went to people who deserved it, who appreciated it, who said thank you and meant it. The charities I donated to sent representatives to my funeral. People I'd never met, but who knew what I'd done, who knew I'd given them something significant, and they stood at the back of the chapel during the will reading. And when Ronald finished, they came forward, and they shook his hand, and they thanked me, thanked my memory, thanked my choice. And one woman, from a women's shelter, she said to Rebecca as she was leaving, "Your mother saved lives with this donation. I hope you know that. I hope you know that her absence in your life gave presents to dozens of women who had nothing, who needed someone to see them, and she saw them even though you couldn't see her." And Rebecca didn't respond, just walked faster to her car, and I thought, good, let that follow you. Let that echo in your head at night. Let that be the thing you can't escape. 5 years have passed since my death, and the world has mostly moved on, the way worlds do, life continuing despite individual tragedies, stories replacing old ones, and I've become a cautionary tale, the mother who died alone and angry, the woman who weaponized her will, the vindictive old lady who punished her daughter from beyond the grave, and I accept that characterization because the alternative, being forgotten entirely, being erased completely, would have been worse. At least now I'm remembered. At least now when people talk about Rebecca, they mention me. At least now I exist in the narrative, even if I exist as the villain. Rebecca tried to tell her side of the story once, gave an interview to a local magazine about work-life balance, about the challenges of being a working mother, about the impossible expectations women face, and the interviewer asked about her mother, asked about the will, asked her to explain what happened, and Rebecca said, "My mother was mentally ill at the end, made choices that weren't rational. I've forgiven her, but it's been difficult." And the interviewer, a young woman who'd clearly done her homework, said. Your mother's doctor testified she was completely lucid. The courts upheld the will. So what exactly was mentally ill about knowing you'd excluded her from family photographs and deciding she didn't want to reward that behavior? And Rebecca ended the interview, walked out, and the magazine ran it anyway. Ran the whole thing. Ran the part where Rebecca couldn't answer, couldn't defend herself, couldn't make herself look good. And I'm told the article went viral, got shared thousands of times. Became a discussion point about elder abuse, about how society treats aging parents, about the cruelty of exclusion. And Rebecca had to shut down her social media accounts because people kept commenting, kept asking her to explain, kept refusing to let her control the narrative, and that right there was worth everything. Ethan got married last year, married a kind woman named Sarah, and they had the wedding at a small vineyard, intimate, just close family and friends. And Sophia texted my old number that no one has, that doesn't exist anymore. But she texted it anyway because she needed to tell me, needed to say, Grandma, I wish you were here. Ethan's getting married, and all I can think about is you, about how you would have loved Sarah, about how you would have cried happy tears, about how you should be in these photographs. And Mom is here, but she looks wrong, looks like she doesn't belong. And I think maybe that's because the person who should be here isn't. And I'm so sorry. Sorry we didn't fight harder for you. Sorry we let Mom erase you. Sorry we didn't know you were dying. And I wanted to text back. Wanted to say, it's okay. You were children. This wasn't your fault. But dead people can't text. Can't reach across the divide. Can't comfort the living no matter how much they want to. Daniel. Remarried too? Married a woman with 3 kids of her own, and by all accounts, he's happy. Genuinely happy, in a way he never was with Rebecca. And he brings his new family to my grave sometimes, introduces them to me, says, this is Dorothy. She was my mother-in-law. She was an amazing woman who deserved better than she got. And I want you all to know her story. And his new wife brings flowers, usually roses, sometimes tulips. And his stepchildren ask questions. Ask what I was like. Ask why Rebecca doesn't visit. And Daniel tells them the truth, doesn't sugarcoat it, says, sometimes people make choices that have permanent consequences. Sometimes you lose people not because they die, but because you stopped valuing them when they were alive. And that's the saddest kind of loss, because you can never fix it, never apologize, never make it right. And I'm grateful for that. Grateful that Daniel hasn't let me disappear completely, hasn't let Rebecca rewrite history, hasn't let my story become a footnote in someone else's narrative. The house Rebecca lives in now is small, 2 bedrooms, in a neighborhood that's nice but not impressive, and she drives a Honda Civic. Practical, economical, nothing like the luxury SUV she used to drive. And she works from her dining room table, takes Zoom calls in front of a bookshelf she bought from Target. And I heard from Sophia that she looks tired all the time, looks older than she should, looks like someone who's carrying weight she can't put down. And part of me feels bad about that, the mother part. The part that remember rocking her to sleep as a baby. But the other part, the part that died alone and invisible, that part feels satisfied, feels like justice was served, feels like consequences taste bitter, but necessary. Rebecca joined a church last year, started going every Sunday, started volunteering, started trying to be good in visible ways, and I wonder if it's genuine or if it's performance, if she's actually changed, or if she's just trying to rebuild her reputation, trying to look like the kind of person who deserves forgiveness, and I can't know, can't judge from where I am, can only watch and wonder and hope that maybe something in her shifted, maybe losing everything made her realize what she'd lost before that. Maybe hitting rock bottom gave her perspective she didn't have when she was on top. Sophia brings her boyfriend to visit me now. Young man named Marcus, medical student, kind eyes, gentle voice, and he reads my letter, the one that was read at the will. the one Ronald gave copies of to my grandchildren when they turned 18. And after he reads it, he's quiet for a long time, and then he says to Sophia, "Your grandmother was brave, standing up for herself like that, refusing to let people treat her as less than she was. That takes courage, takes strength. And I hope if we have kids someday, we teach them what she tried to teach your mom." And Sophia cries and says, "We will, I promise. We will. I won't make Grandma's mistake of being too gentle, too accommodating, too afraid to demand respect. And I think good. Break the cycle. Be different. Be better. Be the woman I wish I'd been earlier. Before I'd given away so much of myself, there was almost nothing left. The money I left keeps doing good, keeps changing lives, and that's legacy. That's immortality. Not the genetic kind, but the impact kind. The kind where your choices ripple outward long after you're gone. And I think about the alternative. About if I'd left everything to Rebecca. About how she would have spent it on things that don't matter. Material possessions that decay. Status symbols that mean nothing. And instead, it went to education, to safety, to giving people chances they wouldn't have had, and that feels right. Feels like the best possible ending to a life that felt meaningless there at the end. Ronald died last year. Heart attack, quick and painless, and I like to think he's here with me now. Wherever here is, comparing notes about difficult daughters and disappointed mothers, and I told him, "Thank you. Thank you for making my voice heard. Thank you for making sure the letter was read. Thank you for giving me the tools to fight back the only way I could." And he smiled and said, "Dorothy, you didn't need me to be strong. You were always strong. You just finally decided to stop hiding it." And maybe he was right. Maybe I had always been strong and just never used it, never claimed it, never insisted on it until it was too late to matter to the one person I wanted it to matter to. Patricia retired 2 years ago, moved to Florida, sends me postcards sometimes, addresses them to my grave, drops them in the mail knowing they'll never arrive but needing to send them anyway, because that's what you do with people you cared for. You keep talking to them, keep updating them, keep including them even when they can't respond. And her postcards say things like, "Dorothy, you'd love it here, warm every day, beach walks, found a church group, made friends. Sometimes I think about you, about those last weeks, about how peaceful you were once you made your decision, about how I knew you were doing something important, even though I didn't know what. And I'm glad you found your voice, glad you didn't go silent. And I wish I could write back, wish I could tell her those weeks with her were the only time I felt seen at the end. Felt cared for, not because of obligation, but because of simple human kindness. And that mattered. That sustained me. That made dying less lonely. The church ladies who came to my funeral still talk about me, still use my story as a teaching moment. I heard from Sophia, who heard from someone who overheard. They use me as an example in Bible study about honoring your parents, about the commandment that comes with a promise, and they say, Dorothy Whitmore died alone because her daughter forgot what honor means, forgot that respecting your mother isn't optional, isn't something you do when it's convenient, and look what happened. Look how it all fell apart. That's not God punishing anyone. That's just the natural consequence of breaking the most basic human bond, and I appreciate that. Appreciate being used as a lesson even if the lesson is cautionary. Even if I'm the ghost in the story, the warning, the example of what happens when love becomes one-sided and finally, inevitably, stops. Rebecca's business partner, the woman who bought her out, sent flowers to my grave on the 5th anniversary of my death. Elaborate arrangement, expensive, with a card that said, "To Dorothy, who taught me that loyalty matters more than profit, who showed me that how you treat people when they have nothing to give you reveals everything about your character. Thank you for the lesson. Sorry you had to be the one to teach it. And I don't know this woman, never met her, but somehow my death spoke to her. Somehow my story reached her, and that's something, that's impact, that's meaning beyond the personal pain. The scholarship fund is growing, getting donations from people who read about it, who heard my story, who want to be part of something good, something that helps instead of hurts. And last year they named it the Dorothy Whitmore Foundation for First-Generation Scholars, gave it official nonprofit status, hired a director, and now it's bigger than I ever imagined. Funding not just 1 or 2 students a year, but 10, 15, and they're talking about expanding, about creating mentorship programs, about building something lasting. And I think about how Rebecca could have been part of this, could have carried on my legacy, could have made my death mean something beautiful. But she's not. She's absent. She's missing. She's too ashamed to be associated with the mother she spent years trying to erase. And that's sad, sadder than anything else, because she's missing the redemption arc. Missing the chance to turn tragedy into meaning. Missing the opportunity to prove she learned something. Ethan named his daughter Dorothy. My name? Didn't ask Rebecca's permission. Just did it. And when Rebecca found out, she apparently cried. Not happy tears, but grief tears, regret tears. Tears that said she finally understood what she'd lost, what she'd thrown away. And Sophia told me that Rebecca tried to visit me then, got in her car, drove to the cemetery, sat in the parking lot for 2 hours, but couldn't get out, couldn't walk to my grave, couldn't face me even in death. And she drove home and hasn't tried again since. And I think that's fitting. Think that's exactly right. Because she spent years making it impossible for me to reach her. And now she's learned that death makes that impossibility permanent, makes that distance unbridgeable, makes that absence absolute. People ask Sophia sometimes, ask her why her grandmother did it, why I cut Rebecca out so completely. And Sophia has an answer now. She's thought about it, processed it, and she says, my grandmother didn't cut my mom out. My mom cut herself out years before. My grandmother just made it official, just stopped pretending there was a relationship when there wasn't, just stopped giving and giving to someone who only took, and that's not cruelty, that's self-respect, that's boundaries, that's saying, I deserve better than invisible. And if you can't give me better, then I'll take my love elsewhere. I'll give it to people who want it, who appreciate it, who say thank you. And I'm proud of her for understanding that, for seeing it clearly, for not letting Rebecca rewrite history into something softer, something more forgivable, something less true. The grave next to mine is still empty. That's where Rebecca will go eventually. That's where she'll spend eternity, right next to the mother she couldn't love properly in life. And I wonder if she thinks about that, if she drives past the cemetery and knows she'll end up here, knows we'll be side by side forever, knows there's no escaping me even after she's gone. And I hope it bothers her, hope it keeps her up at night, hope she has to face in death what she refused to face in life. That I mattered, that I deserved better, that being too old for family photographs was never about age. It was about her shame, her insecurity, her need to erase the parts of her story that didn't fit her image. Daniel brings little Dorothy to see me sometimes, my great-granddaughter who carries my name. And she's 2 now, beautiful, bright-eyed. And Daniel tells her about me, shows her my picture, says, "This is your great-grandma Dorothy. You're named after her. She was strong and brave, and she loved her family even when they didn't love her back the way she deserved, and we're going to make sure you know her story. Make sure you understand that being kind isn't the same as being weak, that giving people chances doesn't mean letting them hurt you forever, that sometimes love means walking away when staying means disappearing." And little Dorothy touches my headstone with her small hand and says, "Hi, Gamma Dottie." And I feel that, feel her innocence, feel her sweetness, Feel hope that maybe this generation will be different, will be better, will remember the lessons their parents forgot. Rebecca hired a therapist finally, started going every week, trying to process everything that happened, trying to understand why her life fell apart, why she lost her husband, why her business failed, why her children look at her with disappointment. And Sophia told me the therapist asked Rebecca to write me a letter. Not to send it, but just to write it, to say everything she never said, to confess everything she couldn't confess. And Rebecca wrote it, wrote pages and pages apparently. And then she came to the cemetery one morning early, when no one else was there. And she read it out loud to my grave, her voice shaking, her hands trembling. And Sophia was there, hiding behind a tree because she'd followed her mother, wanted to witness this, wanted to know if it was real. And she told me later what Rebecca said, told me the words, told me, "Mom, I know you can't forgive me. I know it's too late. I know I destroyed everything. But I need you to hear me. I was wrong. I was cruel. I was so focused on being perfect that I forgot to be good, forgot to be grateful, forgot that you were a person who deserved love, and not just a support system I could use and discard. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I wish I could go back. Wish I could include you in every photograph. Wish I could call you every day. Wish I could sit with you while you were dying and hold your hand and tell you that you mattered, that you were enough, that you were more than enough. But I can't fix this. I can't make it right. I can only live with what I did and hope that somehow, somewhere, I finally understand. I finally see what I lost." Sophia cried while telling me this. Cried because she'd never heard her mother be that honest, that vulnerable, that broken. And she asked me, asked my memory, asked whatever part of me still existed, "Grandma, would that have been enough? If she'd said that while you were alive, would you have forgiven her?" And I don't know, truly don't know. Because part of me thinks yes, of course, she's my daughter. I would have forgiven anything if she'd just acknowledged it. But another part, the part that spent years being erased, thinks maybe not. Maybe some things break too completely to be fixed. Maybe some relationships die before the bodies do, and that's tragic. But it's also honest, and I needed honesty more than I needed false reconciliation. The will reading video exists somewhere. Someone recorded it on their phone, not officially but secretly, and it leaked online, went viral last year. Millions of views. And people debated it, argued about it, divided into teams just like I knew they would. Some saying I was justified, some saying I was cruel. And the comments were vicious on both sides. People who'd never met me or Rebecca deciding who was right, who was wrong, who deserved what. And I found it oddly comforting that even strangers understood the pain of being invisible, understood the rage of being erased, understood that sometimes the only power you have left is what you choose to leave behind. There's a book now. Someone wrote a book about my story, called it The Inheritance of Absence, A Mother's Final Message. And it's about elder abuse, about family dynamics, about the invisible labor of motherhood and what happens when that labor is taken for granted. And the author interviewed everyone. Rebecca declined, but everyone else talked. And it became a bestseller, became required reading in some social work programs, became part of the conversation about how we treat aging parents. And I never wanted to be famous, never wanted attention, just wanted to be seen by my own daughter. But I'll take this. I'll take being remembered for standing up instead of being forgotten for staying silent. Rebecca lost custody of Sophia 2 years ago, not legally. Sophia just stopped going, stopped visiting, stopped answering calls, moved in with Daniel and his new family, and refused to see her mother. And Rebecca tried to fight it, hired lawyers, claimed parental alienation. But Sophia is 17, almost an adult, and the judge asked her why. "Why don't you want to see your mother?" And Sophia said, Because she spent my whole life teaching me that love is conditional, that being enough requires being perfect, that grandma wasn't good enough to be in photographs, and I don't want to become someone who measures people like that, who erases them when they don't fit the image. And I need space from that, need to unlearn that, need to become someone different. And the judge said, "Okay, you're old enough to decide." And Rebecca walked out of the courthouse alone, completely alone, and I think that's when it finally hit her, finally sank in, that she'd lost everyone, lost her mother, her husband, her business, her children, lost everything because she couldn't see value in anything that didn't reflect well on her. So here I am, 5 years dead, more present in my family's life now than I was in the last years of my living, and I suppose that's the point, that's the lesson. That's what I wanted them to understand. That death doesn't have to be the end of your voice if you use the tools you have, if you speak clearly while you still can, if you refuse to let your erasure continue into eternity. I was Dorothy Whitmore, bookkeeper, widow, mother, grandmother, woman who baked pumpkin pies from scratch and wore lavender dresses to weddings and drove 15-year-old station wagons and was told she was too old for family photographs. And I refused to accept that verdict, refused to die invisible, refused to let my daughter's narrative be the final word. And whether that makes me a hero or a villain depends on who's telling the story. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe that's exactly right, because I spent my whole life letting other people tell my story. And in the end, I took it back. I said, no, this is mine. This is my truth. This is what happened. And you can judge me all you want, but you can't erase me anymore. You can't make me disappear. You can't pretend I didn't matter, because I did. I do. I always will. And that's worth everything. Worth the anger. Worth the pain. Worth dying alone if it meant finally being seen. So now I ask you one final time, was I right? Was I justified? Was cutting Rebecca out of my will the act of a wounded mother protecting her dignity, or the revenge of a bitter woman who couldn't forgive? Team Dorothy or Team Rebecca? Drop your verdict below. Tell me what you really think. Because even now, even here, I need to know I wasn't wrong. I need to know that standing up for myself wasn't the same as being cruel. I need to know that somewhere, someone understands why a woman who loved her daughter more than anything chose absence over invisibility. And if you're listening to this and you have a mother, a father, someone who loved you first and longest and most completely, someone you've been taking for granted, someone you've been slowly erasing because they don't fit your image anymore, call them, include them, see them before it's too late, before they're gone, before you're the one reading a letter at a funeral and understanding too late what you lost, because some things can't be fixed after death. Some apologies can't reach across that divide, and you'll spend the rest of your life wishing you'd done better when you still could. Next week, you'll hear from my granddaughter Sophia. She has her own story to tell. Her own confession about the choice she made that cost her everything, but gave her back herself. And trust me, you won't want to miss it. These stories of family and pain and standing up, they're the realest things we have. So subscribe if you want more confessions like this. More truth that hurts but heals. More voices from people who refuse to stay silent, even when silence would have been easier. I'll be here, in whatever way I exist now, waiting to see what you decide, waiting for your verdict, waiting to know if my death meant something or if I just became another cautionary tale. And either way, at least I'm remembered, at least I spoke, at least nobody can say I went quietly. Team Dorothy or Team Rebecca? The choice is yours.